On June 18, 1967, at the Monterey Pop Festival, Jimi Hendrix knelt on stage, poured lighter fluid over a Fender Stratocaster worth less than $200, and set on fire in front of tens of thousands of people. Just 4 years later, he was dead at 27. The world called it the greatest performance in rock history. But what if that moment wasn't a stunt at all? What was the first sign that a genius was already saying goodbye to himself? In less than 48 months, Jimi Hendrix went from sleeping on friends' couches to redefining what a guitar and a human being on stage could be. By 1968, he was earning more per concert than many bands made in a year, yet he rarely slept, barely ate, and lived in a constant blur of airports, hotel rooms, and expectations he never agreed to carry. Every night, the crowd wanted to fire again. Every night, he felt a little less like himself. Behind the myth, there was a quieter truth most fans never saw. Hendrix hated being called a rock god. He hated repeating himself. He hated that the same sound that made the world scream left him feeling empty once the lights went out. Friends noticed the cracks early. His anxiety, his exhaustion, the way he spoke about music as if it were no longer freedom, but obligation. He wasn't chasing excess. He was trying to silence the noise in his head. By 1969, the pressure was relentless. New albums demanded, tours booked back-to-back, managers pushing him to be louder, wilder, more shocking. Hendrix wanted to slow down, to build something deeper, to disappear into sound rather than explode on command. Instead, he was trapped inside the image of the man who burned a guitar and made history. The world celebrated the legend. The man inside was quietly running out of air. So when a genius realizes that his greatest moment has become his prison, how long can he survive before the music stops being salvation and turns into a warning? Long before the world knew his name, Jimi Hendrix learned what instability felt like. Born in 1942 in Seattle, he entered a home defined by poverty, alcohol, and constant emotional uncertainty. His father struggled to hold himself together. His mother drifted in and out of his life, and by the time Jimi was still a child, she was gone for good. There was no dramatic farewell, no closure, just an absence that quietly rewired how he connected to the world. How does a child learn safety when the ground beneath him never stops moving? As a boy, Jimi rarely spoke about his pain. Instead, he disappeared inward. Teachers described him as distant. Classmates saw him as strange, and neighbors remember a kid who seemed older than his years, but carried himself like someone expecting disappointment. In a household where arguments were loud and love was inconsistent, silence became his shield. Music hadn't arrived yet, but solitude already had. When a child learns early that attention can hurt, where does he go to feel whole? His first guitar wasn't even real, just a broomstick he pretended to play for hours. It wasn't imagination for fun. It was rehearsal for survival. When he finally got his hands on an actual instrument, everything shifted. The guitar didn't judge. It didn't leave. It didn't demand explanations. For Jimi, sound became a language safer than words, a place where emotions could exist without being interrogated. Was it any wonder that music became less of a hobby and more of a lifeline? By his early teens, Hendrix wasn't just learning chords. He was learning how to disappear inside them. He practiced obsessively, not chasing fame, but chasing relief. Every note was a way to regulate a nervous system shaped by chaos. Friends later recalled how he played as if possessed, not flashy yet, but deeply focused, almost trance-like. This wasn't performance. It was escape. And when escape becomes a necessity, what happens when the world starts watching? At 17, Hendrix joined the U.S. Army, hoping structure might fix what childhood had broken. Instead, it exposed how incompatible he was with rigid systems. Discipline suffocated him, authority confused him, and rules felt arbitrary. Music followed him even there, played quietly, defiantly, as if reminding him who he was before uniforms tried to erase him. The Army labeled him unreliable. In reality, he was simply wired differently. If society couldn't hold him, where was he supposed to belong? After leaving the military, Hendrix drifted through the American music circuit, playing behind other artists, sleeping wherever he could, always on the edge of being overlooked. He was talented, unmistakably so, but too unconventional, too expressive, too uncontrollable. Producers told him to tone it down. Band leaders told him to stand still. Every instruction pushed him further from the one thing that had saved him as a child: freedom. How long can a soul survive when its only refuge is constantly restricted? What formed in those years wasn't just a musician, but a fragile psychological foundation. Hendrix learned to attach deeply to sounds, to sensations, to moments, because people had proven unreliable. He learned to give everything when he felt seen, and to vanish when he didn't. These patterns would later fuel his brilliance and his destruction. The world would celebrate his intensity, but few understood where it came from. And if the roots of his genius were planted in instability, was a collapse already written into the story? From the very beginning, Jimi Hendrix wasn't running toward fame. He was running away from silence, from loss, from the feeling of being unanchored in his own life. Music gave him gravity. But when gravity comes from pain, how long before it pulls everything down with it? When Jimi Hendrix entered the professional music world, it wasn't as a star, it was as a shadow. By the early 1960s, he was drifting through the American rhythm and blues circuit, hired not to be seen but to support others. He played behind names like Little Richard and the Isley Brothers, standing a few steps back from the spotlight, instructed to follow, not to lead. The irony was brutal. A once-in-a-generation talent being told, night after night, to stay quiet. How do you discover who you are when every room asks you to be less? Hendrix learned quickly that brilliance alone wasn't enough. The industry rewarded predictability, not originality. Every time he pushed his guitar too far, too loud, too expressive, too strange, he was warned. Managers told him his playing was distracting. Band leaders complained he moved too much on stage. He was fired more than once for being uncontrollable. What they really meant was that he didn't fit the template. In a world built on formulas, where does a singular voice go? Financially, these years were unstable. Hendrix slept on couches, borrowed instruments, and survived on inconsistent paychecks. Yet creatively, something crucial was happening. Free from the pressure of fame, he was experimenting, bending notes, feeding back sound, treating the guitar not as an instrument but as an extension of his nervous system. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was trying to understand himself. And slowly, painfully, a new language began to form. But if no one is listening, does that language still exist? By 1966, America had made its decision. There was no clear place for him. It was then that fate intervened, not through opportunity, but through escape. Hendrix left for London, a city more open to reinvention, more willing to celebrate what America rejected. Almost overnight, the shift was dramatic. British musicians didn't tell him to tone it down. They watched in disbelief. For the first time, he wasn't a problem to manage. He was a phenomenon to witness. But what happens when validation arrives too suddenly? London didn't just change Hendrix's career. It changed his identity. Surrounded by curiosity instead of control, he exploded creatively. He dressed differently, spoke differently, played as if nothing was holding him back. Within months, he wasn't just accepted, he was mythologized. The same qualities that got him fired in the U.S. were now being praised as revolutionary. Yet beneath the excitement was a familiar tension. If he had to cross an ocean to be understood, did he truly belong anywhere? With recognition came construction. Managers, labels, and media began shaping Jimi Hendrix into something sellable. The wild clothes, the mystique, the onstage chaos, it all became part of the brand. Hendrix went along with it, partly because he needed the opportunity, partly because he didn't yet know how to protect himself. He had found a path, but it wasn't entirely his own. When the world finally sees you, do they see the truth or only what they can market? This was the paradox of his early rise. Hendrix had escaped invisibility, but at the cost of control. He was no longer being told to disappear. Now he was being asked to become larger than life. Interviews, photo shoots, expectations. Each step forward carried a new demand. The freedom he chased as a child was now framed by contracts and schedules. He had broken out of one cage only to discover another. How many transformations can one person survive before something fractures? Still, the music was undeniable. Every performance felt alive, dangerous, unscripted. Hendrix wasn't following a roadmap. He was building one in real time. That authenticity drew people in, even as it drained him. He gave everything because that's how he had always survived, by fully committing or vanishing entirely. The industry interpreted this as passion. In truth, it was vulnerability. And vulnerability, once exposed, rarely goes unexploited. By the time the world began to call him a genius, Hendrix was already exhausted. He had found his path, yes, but it was narrow, fast, and unforgiving. The same intensity that set him apart was now accelerating him toward a future he hadn't chosen. If discovering your true self means losing the ability to slow down, is that freedom or the beginning of another kind of trap? By 1967, the transformation was complete. Jimi Hendrix was no longer an emerging force. He was a standard by which modern rock performance would be measured. Albums flew off shelves, tickets sold out within hours, and critics struggled to invent new language to describe what they were witnessing. Hendrix wasn't just playing music. He was bending time, sound, and expectation into something visceral and uncontrollable. But when the world places a halo on your head, how long before it becomes a weight? The Monterey Pop Festival marked more than a breakthrough. It sealed a myth. The guitar fire wasn't rehearsed marketing. It was impulse, symbolism, release. In one act, Hendrix announced that rules no longer applied. The crowd saw danger and freedom intertwined, and they wanted more. From that night on, every performance was measured against that moment. Every stage expected spectacle. Every audience waited for transcendence. When your peak becomes a requirement instead of a miracle, what happens to the artist underneath? Success arrived fast, and it arrived loudly. Hendrix headlined major festivals, toured relentlessly across continents, and became one of the highest-paid performers of his era. Songs like Purple Haze, Hey Joe, and The Wind Cries Mary didn't just dominate charts. They redefined what popular music could sound like. Studios became laboratories, concerts became rituals, and Hendrix became the conduit. Yet even as his influence expanded, his sense of self quietly narrowed. If the world only loves a version of you that shocks them, where does the rest of you go? Behind the scenes, the cost was escalating. The touring schedule was brutal. Sometimes multiple shows in a single day, city after city, with little rest in between. Interviews blurred together. Hotel rooms lost meaning. Hendrix began to feel less like a person and more like a traveling event. Applause followed him everywhere, but genuine connection didn't. He was surrounded constantly, yet deeply alone. Is isolation more dangerous when it happens in front of millions? Creatively, the pressure was suffocating. Every new album had to outdo the last. Innovation was no longer optional. It was expected. Hendrix obsessed over sound, layering tracks, chasing textures no one else could hear yet. Perfectionism crept in, fueled by fear rather than joy. What once felt like exploration now felt like obligation. The same sensitivity that made him extraordinary also made him vulnerable to collapse. How do you protect a fragile inner world when the outside demands infinite output? The media played its part. Hendrix was portrayed as wild, untamed, almost inhuman. Headlines focused on excess, image, and shock value, rarely on the discipline or emotional cost behind the art. He became a character in a story he didn't write. Fans adored him, but few truly saw him. And the more the myth grew, the harder it became to step outside it. Can you ever reclaim yourself once the legend is more valuable than the truth? Despite the chaos, there were moments of pure alignment, nights when the music flowed effortlessly, when Hendrix seemed at peace inside the sound. Those moments kept him going. They reminded him why he started, why he endured. But they were becoming rarer. Fatigue crept into his hands, doubt into his mind. The halo still shone, but cracks were forming beneath it. And no one wanted to hear about cracks in a god. By the end of this phase, Hendrix stood at the highest point of his career, and the edge of something darker. The world saw a conqueror. He felt like a prisoner of his own brilliance. The peak had arrived, but it demanded everything in return. And when success takes more than it gives, how long before the light turns blinding instead of beautiful? By 1969, the silence inside Jimi Hendrix had become impossible to reach. The noise followed him everywhere. Crowds chanting his name, managers talking numbers, labels demanding deadlines, journalists asking the same questions with different microphones. What the world called momentum, Hendrix experienced as erosion. Each day took something small from him: sleep, patience, clarity, a sense of ownership over his own life. When everything you touch turns into expectation, where do you rest? The pressure wasn't just external, it was psychological. Hendrix was acutely aware that he was expected to reinvent the impossible over and over again. The guitar fire, the feedback, the transcendence. Audiences didn't come to hear music. They came to witness revelation. And revelation, by definition, isn't sustainable. Hendrix knew this. He felt it every time he stepped on stage and sensed the crowd waiting not for sound, but for spectacle. How do you remain human when your role is to be myth? Insomnia became routine. Nights blurred into mornings without rest, his mind looping endlessly over unfinished ideas, missed notes, imagined failures. He began to doubt himself, not his talent, but his ability to survive the pace of it. Friends recalled moments when he spoke softly about wanting things to slow down, about longing for quiet, about disappearing into the studio without an audience. Yet every attempt to pause was met with resistance. Tours were booked. Contracts were signed. The machine didn't stop for reflection. If the world profits from your exhaustion, who benefits from your well-being? Substances entered the picture not as indulgence, but as management. Hendrix didn't use them to escape pleasure. He used them to regulate overload, to sleep, to calm the storm, to mute the constant internal feedback. What outsiders labeled excess was, for him, an attempt at balance in a life that had none. But borrowed calm always comes with interest. And slowly, the line between coping and dependence began to blur. At what point does survival quietly turn into self-erasure? Relationships suffered first. Hendrix struggled with intimacy, oscillating between deep attachment and sudden withdrawal. He wanted closeness, but feared entrapment. Every bond felt temporary, every promise fragile. Fame magnified this instability. People wanted access to his talent, his aura, his time, but few understood his vulnerability. Loneliness became paradoxical. The more famous he became, the less seen he felt. Can loneliness be louder than applause? Creatively, the cracks widened. Hendrix became obsessively meticulous in the studio, recording dozens of takes, chasing sounds only he could hear. Perfectionism masked anxiety. Each track felt like a test he might fail. Music, once a refuge, now carried stakes. It had to justify the myth. It had to prove he was still worthy of the pedestal. And when art becomes a defense mechanism, how long before it collapses under its own weight? The industry noticed changes, missed appointments, erratic moods, performances that swung between brilliance and detachment. Some labeled him unreliable. Others whispered about burnout. Few asked the obvious question: how much can one nervous system endure before it breaks? Hendrix wasn't unraveling because he lacked discipline. He was unraveling because he'd been stretched beyond any sustainable limit. His sensitivity, the very source of his genius, was now his greatest liability. Perhaps the cruelest twist was that the world still celebrated him. Awards, headlines, sold-out shows, all signaling success. But inside, Hendrix felt increasingly disconnected from the image bearing his name. Jimi Hendrix had become a role he performed, not a self he inhabited. The distance between the man and the myth grew wider with every passing month. And when you no longer recognize the person everyone loves, who are you allowed to be? By the end of this phase, the warning signs were undeniable. Exhaustion had turned chronic. Joy had turned mechanical. Music still poured out of him, but it carried a different weight. Less wonder, more urgency. The fire that once symbolized freedom now threatened to consume him entirely. And if a genius realizes he's burning faster than he can heal, does he slow down? Or does he keep playing until there's nothing left? By early 1970, the collapse was no longer subtle. Jimi Hendrix began to speak openly, though quietly, about feeling lost inside his own success. Friends recalled conversations where he questioned whether he was still making music for himself or merely feeding an expectation he no longer recognized as his own. The joy that once surged through his body when he played had been replaced by a sense of duty, almost dread. When passion turns into obligation, how long before the soul rebels? On stage, the contradiction was painful. Some nights, Hendrix was transcendent, unreachable, almost supernatural. Other nights, he appeared distant, distracted, as if watching himself from somewhere far away. Critics noticed the inconsistency. Audiences debated whether he was declining or simply evolving. What few understood was that both could be true at once. Evolution requires space. Hendrix had none. Can growth survive without silence? The weight of representation added another layer. As a black artist in a predominantly white rock world, Hendrix carried expectations he never asked for. He was projected onto, politicized, symbolized. Every choice was scrutinized, every deviation interpreted. He didn't want to be a spokesman or an icon. He wanted to be a musician, yet the world insisted on meaning beyond his control. When identity becomes a battlefield, where does rest exist? Financial and legal tensions intensified the strain. Contracts felt suffocating. Management relationships grew adversarial. Hendrix sensed that decisions were being made around him, not with him. Control slipped further away. He responded the only way he knew how, by retreating inward, by playing longer, harder, louder, hoping the music might still save him. But salvation delayed is not salvation denied. It is often salvation lost. At what point does persistence become self-harm? His health deteriorated. Sleep became fragmented, appetite inconsistent, energy unpredictable. What had once been youthful resilience gave way to chronic fatigue. Hendrix pushed through it anyway, believing that stopping would mean disappearance. For someone whose entire life had been defined by being unseen, the idea of fading terrified him. But what is more dangerous, to vanish from the stage or to vanish from yourself? Emotionally, he oscillated between clarity and despair. There were moments of sharp self-awareness when he articulated exactly what was wrong, the pace, the noise, the lack of agency. And then there were moments of numbness, when everything felt distant and unreal. This psychological whiplash eroded his sense of continuity. Days lost structure. Time lost meaning. When life becomes a series of disconnected moments, how do you plan for a future? The tragedy wasn't a single catastrophic event. It was accumulation, missed chances to pause, ignored warnings, systems that prioritized output over humanity. Hendrix didn't fall apart because he was weak. He fell apart because he was sensitive in a world that rewards endurance over awareness. His genius required protection. Instead, it was exposed. And exposure, sustained long enough, becomes destruction. As the months passed, Hendrix stood at a crossroads he never publicly announced. One path led deeper into a machine that made him famous. The other required stepping away, risking relevance, choosing obscurity over survival. He spoke of wanting to change, to reset, to build something quieter and more honest. But wanting is not the same as being allowed. And when the choice is delayed too long, the body often decides for you. By the time the world sensed something was wrong, the damage was already done. Hendrix was still performing, still recording, still giving. But the cost had exceeded anything he could replenish. The internal collapse was complete, even if the external image remained intact. And when a man continues to give long after he has nothing left, is he in surprise or an inevitability? The darkness didn't arrive suddenly. It arrived patiently, disguised as success, applause, and obligation. And as Hendrix moved forward, exhausted but hopeful, one question lingered beneath every note he played. Could music still be a place of rebirth, or had it become the very force that was slowly pulling him under? In mid-1970, something shifted inside Jimi Hendrix. Not dramatically, not publicly, but decisively. After years of being pulled forward by momentum he didn't control, he began to imagine a different future, one not built around spectacle or exhaustion. For the first time since his rise, Hendrix wasn't thinking about how to go bigger. He was thinking about how to go deeper. But can rebirth begin while the old life is still demanding its dues? The clearest sign of this shift was his obsession with creating a space of his own. The Electric Lady Studios was not just a business move. It was a psychological one. Hendrix wanted autonomy, a place where time slowed down, where experimentation didn't have to justify itself, where music could exist without an audience waiting to be shocked. For someone whose entire career had been defined by being watched, the idea of privacy was radical. Was this his attempt to finally protect a part of himself that fame had left exposed? Inside the studio, a different Hendrix emerged. He worked patiently, layering sounds, chasing mood rather than impact. The music hinted at new directions: funk, soul, jazz, introspection. Less fire, more atmosphere. Those close to him sensed something important happening. He spoke about future albums, about changing the way he toured, about reclaiming control. There was fatigue, yes, but also intention. For the first time in years, he wasn't just reacting, he was choosing. But was there still enough strength left to follow through? Yet the world he was trying to step away from refused to loosen its grip. Obligations lingered. Unfinished tours, contractual pressures, expectations he had trained audiences to hold. Hendrix was caught between two selves: the icon the world demanded and the artist he was trying to become. Transition is fragile even in calm conditions. For Hendrix, it unfolded under relentless pressure. How do you shed a skin when everyone profits from keeping it intact? Physically, the cost of the past years remained. His body didn't recover the way it once had. Rest felt incomplete. Focus came in waves, followed by crashes. Still, he pushed forward, believing that meaning might restore what exhaustion had taken. There's a dangerous hope in that belief. The idea that purpose alone can heal damage already done. How often do artists mistake momentum for recovery? Emotionally, there was a quiet seriousness to him now. Friends described him as reflective, less impulsive, more inward. The bravado that once defined his public image softened. He listened more. He spoke about music as conversation rather than conquest. It was as if he had finally reached maturity. His career never allowed him time to develop. But maturity without rest is a fragile thing. Can wisdom arrive too late to save the body carrying it? This period wasn't a comeback. It was a recalibration. Hendrix wasn't trying to reclaim fame. He was trying to redefine success. Smaller audiences, more control, less noise. These were not the ambitions of someone chasing legacy, but of someone chasing sustainability. The tragedy is not that he lacked vision. It's that the transition required time he no longer had. When change demands patience, and patience demands energy, what happens when energy is gone? There were moments of optimism. New music took shape. Conversations hinted at future collaborations and different touring models. Hendrix seemed aware of what had nearly destroyed him and determined not to repeat it. That awareness matters. It suggests agency, not surrender. And yet, awareness does not undo years of depletion. Healing is not instantaneous. It requires safety, consistency, and rest. Three things his life still struggled to provide. The turning point, then, was real but incomplete. Hendrix stood at the threshold of a rebirth he had finally named. He had identified the problem, envisioned a solution, and taken the first steps toward it. What he couldn't do was escape the gravitational pull of the past fast enough. The old life lingered, heavy and unresolved, pulling at the edges of the new one. And when rebirth is delayed, it often arrives as something else entirely. Still, this moment matters. It reframes the ending. Hendrix was not spiraling blindly toward destruction. He was trying, consciously, deliberately, to survive himself. The attempt at rebirth reveals the deepest truth of his story. He didn't want to burn forever. He wanted to last. And if the desire to change appears only when collapse is near, is that failure or the most human instinct of all? As Hendrix moved forward into the final chapter of his life, the question was no longer whether he could reinvent his music. It was whether he could outrun the damage already done long enough to live inside that reinvention. And when hope and exhaustion collide at the same moment, which one decides the outcome? When Jimi Hendrix died in September 1970, the world rushed to explain it. Headlines searched for causes, rumors searched for blame, and mythology filled the silence faster than truth ever could. He was 27, and within hours, his life was no longer his. It became a symbol, a warning, a legend, flattened into a narrative that felt easier consumed than complexity he actually lived. But what happens when a human life is remembered only at the speed of its ending? In the immediate aftermath, grief mixed with confusion. Fans mourned the loss of a genius. The industry mourned the loss of a phenomenon. Few paused to consider what Hendrix himself had been trying to become in his final months. The conversations he was having, the music he was moving toward, the quieter future he was sketching but never allowed to inhabit. Death froze him in the image of intensity. Even though he had been reaching for restraint, his legacy shaped by who we were, or by who the world needed us to remain. The years that followed elevated Hendrix to near mythic status. His influence spread rapidly, crossing genres, generations, and borders. Guitarists studied him like scripture. Producers borrowed his sonic curiosity. Artists saw in him permission to break rules, to blend identities, to treat music as exploration rather than product. His work didn't age. It expanded. What does it mean when someone is gone, yet their presence keeps growing? Perhaps the most profound aspect of Hendrix's legacy is not technical, but emotional. He normalized vulnerability inside power, chaos inside control, sensitivity inside volume. Long before conversations about mental health, burnout, or creative exhaustion entered mainstream discourse, Hendrix embodied all of them, without language, without protection. His life quietly asked questions the culture wasn't ready to answer yet. How do we care for our most gifted individuals without consuming them? Artists like Prince, among many others, didn't just admire Hendrix. They understood him. They recognized the cost of brilliance in a system that rewards output over humanity. The purple aesthetic, the spiritual intensity, the refusal to be boxed in. These weren't coincidences. They were echoes. Hendrix didn't just change how music sounded. He changed how it felt to exist as an artist in public. And feeling, unlike sound, never fades completely. Yet legacy is complicated. For all the inspiration Hendrix left behind, the industry learned slowly, if at all, from his collapse. The cycle repeated with new names, new genres, new stages. Talent discovered, talent accelerated, talent exhausted. Hendrix became the origin point of a pattern that would repeat again and again. Does a legacy still protect us if we refuse to learn from it? Over time, the conversation began to shift. Biographies grew more nuanced. Stories of his gentleness, his introspection, his discomfort with fame emerged. The myth cracked slightly, allowing the man to be seen again. Not as a god, not as a cautionary tale, but as someone who tried to live honestly inside an impossible system. That reframing matters, because it returns dignity to a life that had been oversimplified. Today, Hendrix exists in two parallel forms. One is eternal, the icon, the sound, the fire. The other is fragile, the human being who wanted quiet, control, and time. His true legacy lives in the tension between the two. It reminds us that innovation without care is extraction, and that admiration without protection is not love. Hendrix gave the world new colors. The least we can do is ask what it cost him to paint them. And as his music continues to reach new ears, one question lingers beneath every note, every solo, every burst of feedback. We can still hear his genius. So clearly decades later, why do we struggle so much to hear his need for rest while he was still alive? In the end, Jimi Hendrix wasn't destroyed by excess, scandal, or a lack of discipline. He was undone by something far more familiar and far more uncomfortable to confront. A world that demanded brilliance without pause, transformation without rest, and access without responsibility. His life wasn't a cautionary tale about talent gone wrong. It was a mirror held up to how we consume those who give us something extraordinary. Hendrix didn't fail to survive fame. Fame failed to learn how to coexist with a sensitive human nervous system. He burned brightly not because he wanted to disappear, but because slowing down was never truly offered as an option. The same intensity that changed music forever was treated as an infinite resource, rather than something fragile that needed protection. And when protection never comes, collapse stops being a possibility and becomes a process. What makes a story endure isn't just the sound, the fire, or the mythology. It's the unresolved question he leaves behind. If genius requires vulnerability, and vulnerability requires care, then what responsibility do we carry as witnesses, fans, and industries? Do we celebrate the moment someone burns brightest? Or do we ask how to keep them alive long enough to grow old with their art? Hendrix once said that music doesn't lie. Perhaps that's why his story still resonates. It tells us a truth we often avoid. Admiration without care is extraction, and applause without boundaries is not love. His Purple Haze never truly faded. It simply drifted into history, asking quietly whether we've learned anything at all.